Chapter 2 Death in the Village. The child who was lost came from a lonely cottage that stands on the slope of a steep hillside called the Alt, or the Height. The land about it is wild and ragged. Here the growth of gorse and bracken, here a marshy hollow of reeds and rushes, marking the course of the stream from some hidden well. Here thickets of dense and tangled undergrowth, the outposts of a wood. Down through this broken and uneven ground, a path leads to the lane at the bottom of the valley. Then the land rises again and swells up to the cliffs over the sea, about a quarter of a mile away. The little girl, Gertrude Morgan, asked her mother if she might go down to the lane and pick the purple flowers. These were orchids that grew there, and her mother gave her leave, telling her that she must be sure to be back by tea time, as there was apple tart for tea. She never came back. It was supposed that she must have crossed the road and gone to the cliff's edge, possibly in order to pick the sea pinks that were then in full blossom. She must have slipped, they said, and fallen into the sea 200 feet below. And it may be said at once, there was no doubt some truth in this conjecture, though it stopped very far short of the whole truth. The child's body must have been carried out by the tide, for it was never found. The conjecture of a false step or of a fatal slide on the slippery turf that slopes down to the rocks was accepted as being the only explanation possible. People thought the accident a strange one because, as a rule, country children living by the cliffs and the sea become wary at an early age, and Gertrude Morgan was almost 10 years old. Still, as the neighbors say, that's how it must have happened, and it's a great pity to be sure. But this would not do when, in a week's time, a strong young laborer failed to come to his cottage after the day's work. His body was found on the rock 6 or 7 miles from the cliffs where the child was supposed to have fallen. He was going home by a path that he had used every night of his life for 8 or 9 years, that he used of dark nights in perfect security, knowing every inch of it. The police asked if he drank, but he was a teetotaler, if he were subject to fits, but he wasn't, and he was not murdered for his wealth, since agricultural laborers are not wealthy. It was only possible again to talk of slippery turf and a false step, but people began to be frightened. Then a woman was found with her neck broken at the bottom of a disused quarry near Llanfihangel, in the middle of the county. The false step theory was eliminated here, for the quarry was guarded with a natural hedge of gorse bushes. One would have to struggle and fight through sharp thorns to destruction in such a place as this. And indeed, the gorse bushes were broken as if someone had rushed furiously through them, just above the place where the woman's body was found. And this was strange. There was a dead sheep lying beside her in the pit, as if the woman and the sheep together had been chased over the brim of the quarry. But chased by whom, or by what? And then there was a new form of terror. This was in the region of the marshes under the mountain. A man and a son, a lad of 14 or 15, set out early one morning to work, and never reached the farm where they were bound. Their way skirted the marsh, but it was broad, firm, and well metalled, and it had been raised about 2 feet above the bog. But when the search was made in the evening of the same day, Phillips and his son were found dead in the marsh, covered with black slime and pondweed. And they lay there some 10 yards from the path, which, it would seem, they must have left deliberately. It was useless, of course, to look for tracks in the black ooze, for if one threw a big stone into it, a few seconds removed all marks of the disturbance. The men who found the 2 bodies beat about the verges and purlieus of the marsh in hope of finding some trace of the murderers. They went to and fro over the rising ground where the black cattle were grazing. They searched the alder thickets by the brook, but they discovered nothing. Most horrible of all these horrors, perhaps, was the affair of the highway, a lonely and unfrequented by-road that winds for many miles on high and lonely land. Here, a mile from any other dwelling, stands a cottage on the edge of a dark wood. It was inhabited by a laborer named Williams, his wife, and their 3 children. One hot summer's evening, a man who had been doing a day's gardening at a rectory 3 or 4 miles away passed the cottage and stopped for a few minutes to chat with Williams, the laborer, who was pottering about his garden while the children were playing on the path by the door. The 2 talked of their neighbors and of the potatoes till Mrs. Williams appeared at the doorway and said supper was ready, and Williams turned to go into the house. This was about 8 o'clock, and in the ordinary course the family would have their supper and be in bed by 9 or by 9:30 at the latest. At 10 o'clock that night, the local doctor was driving home along the highway. His horse shied violently and then stopped dead just opposite the gate to the cottage. The doctor got down, frightened at what he saw, and there on the roadway lay Williams, his wife, and the 3 children, stone dead, all of them. Their skulls were battered in as if by some heavy iron instrument. Their faces were beaten into a pulp.